From its illustrious beginnings in 1920, this festival has celebrated art, and particularly opera, one of the highest theatrical forms dramatizing the human condition. Just as its name, opera, suggests art is a work, a finite act of labor. Please allow a small personal note. You may be surprised, but opera was my great-grandfather Nikita Khrushchev's favorite art. He loved that artistic form. Indeed, the fact of all art is transcendent, shaping and influencing our politics and culture. Early in this century, the government of Great Britain put forward a list of the 10 most important emergency procedures for its defense in the event of a crisis. This list included saving the renowned Titian paintings housed in the National Gallery in London. Imagine if the Titian's masterpieces we love, such as an allegory of prudence, suffered the same fate as the treasures of the Iraqi National Museum in Baghdad after the American invasion in 2003 and were looted by thieves. If there is no similar measures in Austria, they might be merited in order to protect many of the cultural masterpieces held in its collections, not least the unequaled Bruegels in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. The Titian example disputes an often heard claim that high art is dead, that the world has been overcome with triviality, not at the Salzburg Festival, of course, but generally in peace we can afford to be distracted with the minutiae of everyday life. The state of war changes that equation. Nations cherish their cultural individuality as much as they do their territory, natural resources, and financial institutions. Art becomes a battleground. Last year, Ukrainian lawmakers adopted what they call an anti-Pushkin law, named after the 19th century Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, which has allowed for the annihilation of cultural heritage monuments related to Russian and Soviet history in Ukraine. Seen as symbols of imperial and totalitarian ideology, many works of art, including paintings, sculptures, and books by Russian artists, have been forbidden. Summarily canceling the cultural artifacts of another nation or ethnic group is not a viable policy in my view. But under the present circumstances, no Russian should dare to tell Ukrainians how to address their past or construct their future. So I want to take this moment, this opportunity, to state my apology to the Ukrainian people for the war being waged on their country on behalf of all of the Russian nation. I'm not alone in questioning an approach of culture cancellation. I would like to quote George Kennan, one of the greatest American diplomats. Speaking at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1955, at the height of the Cold War, he insisted, "In the creation of beauty and in the great monumental works of the intellect, and there alone, human beings have been able to find an unfailing bridge between nations, even in the darkest moments of political bitterness and chauvinism and exclusiveness. That is, in times of crisis, the power of art skyrockets. Why? Art is prophetic. Culture never lies about politics. Politics may not yet have formulated its agenda, but art has already revealed it. In 2006, the Russian author Vladimir Sorokin wrote a short novel, Day of the Oprichnik. In this book, the Russian Tsardom is back and government henchmen are in charge. At the time, we dismissed it as pure fiction. Today, it reads as reality. In the aftermath of Vladimir Putin's recent fifth-term presidential inauguration, independent thinking is violently punished. All is no longer a dystopian absurdity, as Sorokin described it. It is now the everyday reality of contemporary Russia. Even during my time in the Soviet Union, we read George Orwell's dystopias as fiction. Yet today, Orwell has become a manual for survival. In a bookstore in St. Petersburg last year, I noted a prominent window display of his novel 1984. We have to remember which world we're living in, the shopkeeper commented. In 1947, Cannon famously wrote in Foreign Affairs about what he called the sources of Soviet conduct. If we look at the sources of Russian conduct today, we can see that a lot of it was explained by the 19th century author Fyodor Dostoevsky. In an 1873 letter to the future Emperor Alexander III, Dostoevsky wrote, "Great nations who have manifested their great powers, those that have brought, if only a single ray of light into the world, succeeded because they have remained presumptuously independent." Hence, Putin claims that Russia is a sovereign civilization and therefore acts as it must. If Putin were a better pupil, he would have understood that Dostoevsky's call for national independence was not so much a desire for power, but a conviction that each country's unique contribution adds value to the world of nations. Instead, the Russian president insists he follows an imperial legacy he believed was set forward by many great artists in the past. This inherent connection between politics and culture is so profound, as I once explained, refusing to engage with Russian culture will not force Putin to withdraw his forces from Ukraine, but it cuts off a potential source of information about his objectives and motivations. Art is liberated. The late Russian dissident philosopher Andrei Sinyavsky, known under his pseudonym Abram Terts, spent most of the 1960s in a Soviet labor camp for writing critiques of the communist state. In his memoir, A Voice from the Chorus, Sinyavsky described a prisoner's love for art. Listening to a Beethoven record, the sort of modest thing we don't do on Sundays, as earnestly as free people go into concerts, because here things in short supply are all the more appreciated and valued as a result. Things once common have suddenly become precious. Art matters more in our freedom. Before the collapse of communism at the end of the 1980s, the late American writer Philip Roth observed the difference between being a novelist in the free West versus being a novelist behind the censoring Iron Curtain. In Eastern Europe, nothing is permitted, but everything matters. With us, everything is permitted, but nothing matters, he wrote. Indeed, people in Russia, the center of the communist empire behind the Iron Curtain, saw culture differently versus people in the West. Culture was our liberty. It was an escape, a spiritual, if not physical, freedom denied by the Soviet system. The famed Polish journalist Adam Michnik, one of the leaders of the anti-authoritarian solidarity movement in the 1980s, studied Russian in prison in order to read Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky in their native tongue. He described this reading as one of the greatest experiences of his life. These writers allowed him an escape into their imagined world, but they also influenced his understanding of how better to fight his socialist captors. In 1985, Michnik wrote a letter from the Gdańsk prison explaining how repression will lead the tyrannical governments into a blind alley of destruction. And it did. The Iron Curtain fell a few years later. Now history in the east of Europe is repeating itself. One of this year's sellout festival events is a reading of Alexei Navalny's letters from prison. His letters, like Mitschnitt's, are literary evidence of life in captivity. Navalny is akin to the political prisoners of generations before him, who depicted humanity's condition under oppression and crisis. In his 1862 The House of the Dead, Dostoevsky described his experience of living in a Siberian labor camp for 5 years as punishment for his association with a political group opposing Tsar Nicholas I. 100 years later, in 1962, in one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote of his experiences in Joseph Stalin's Gulag, where he spent almost 10 years. Then there was the 1967 Journey into the Whirlwind by Yevgenia Ginsburg, who detailed her efforts to persevere during the 1940s in the Magadan prison camp, not far from the Arctic Circle. These works are evidence of how art not only documents oppression, but in searching for the meaning of existence, offers a path to survival. They show us how to endure without losing one's humanity, while also bettering humanity in that process. Art is idealistic. Through some sort of alchemy, a work of art, a painting or a sculpture, a symphony or an opera, a novel or a poem, can reflect the best in us. In Russia, hurt is perennial and existential. It is bad for living, but good for creating masterpieces. And this truth is also universal. Through the centuries, examples abound, including Ludwig van Beethoven, Vincent van Gogh, Sergei Prokofiev, Dmitry Shostakovich, James Baldwin, Jamaica Kincaid, and many, many others. The best art grows out of pain in all contexts and on all continents. Appropriately and bravely, given the current trend of rejecting works of art simply for being created by Russians, the Salzburg Festival, at its opening, performs 2 pieces of Russian music. One we already heard by Prokofiev, and the later one is Alfred Schnitzler. The festival also features not 1, but 2 operatic Dostoevsky productions, The Idiot and The Gambler. This year's opera program highlights a line from The Idiot: "Compassion is the only law of mankind." In the same novel, Dostoevsky writes an equally apropos and idealistic line: "The world will be saved by beauty." Art is hopeful. Moreover, it is optimistic. Art saves the world every day, in every century, and every generation. Art is what is left of us when we are gone. Though the Old Testament poses that nothing under the sun is truly new, we nevertheless toil to overcome the most frustrating and the most life-affirming quality of creativity, its incompletion. As long as people live, they will keep striving for their unsurpassed masterpiece, manifesting the indomitable, creative human spirit, hence ensuring the survival of humanity. Take Vladimir Nabokov, a 20th century Russian writer who became an American classic author. An exile from his motherland after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, he rewrote every piece of tragic Russian literature, including works by Anton Chekhov, Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky, all in a happier key. Most Russian narratives are about unjust societies in which people live, readying themselves for death. So Nabokov freed classical Russian characters by giving them a new life where suffering is no longer the norm. Remember the famous opening of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. In Ada or Arda, Nabokov wrote it in 1969, he turns this upside down. All happy families are more or less dissimilar. All unhappy families are more or less alike. These Russian examples are instructive due to the country's geopolitical schizophrenia. It is at once European and not at all. Its imperial, dictatorial, opaque, Byzantine political structure is outdated and ossified. Yet culturally, Russia is largely an offspring of Western European models, multiplied by spirit, suffering, and size. Pushkin's poems, his writing, was an amalgamation of Russian themes and French poetic techniques. Nikolai Gogol, a Russian writer of Ukrainian origin, composed satirical masterpieces, such as his 1940s Dead Souls and Petersburg Tales, that were a singular transformation of the stories by German romantics, such as E.T.A. Hoffmann on Russian soil. Tolstoy's War and Peace was written half in French. In these works lie insights into the universal human condition, not just the Russian one. Art is rebellious. Art cannot prevent tyranny or war, but it debunks them every time. Even when most people in Russia feel they cannot fight against despotism, Russian art is never neutral. It fights, always, for a better society, better humanity, better beauty. If the Kremlin leaders had learned the lessons art has taught about the past dictatorships, dictatorships would not have repeated in Russia so often. But rulers are poor students. They don't appreciate culture. Otherwise, Stalin and Putin would not have canceled masterpieces and imprisoned artists. I spoke about Ukraine rejecting Russian art, but the Kremlin is even more at war with the country's intellectuals, because they do not support Putin's bellicose policies. Despots only love kulturka, or culture abridged, that references their own greatness. The best of Russian art is antithesis to kulturka. Connected to the universal experiences of injustice, it proves that oppression and confrontation invariably fail. In the 1930s, Anna Akhmatova angered Stalin by writing Requiem, a prophetic poem about her and her contemporaries' resolve to outlast the dictator's rule. Several decades later, Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago had a greater role in collapsing communism than most politicians of the late Soviet era. In the 21st century, Russian artists continue the tradition of calling out totalitarian cruelty. In her 2013 oral history account, Secondhand Time, the Belarusian-born Nobel Prize-winning author Svetlana Alexievich described the unhealing scars of ordinary Russians as a result of authoritarianism following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Looking at the Kremlin today, one wonders, how could they not know how their story ends? Art, in its transcendence, shows us the way. Thank you.